Lecture 12, Skepticism and Calvinism, Pierre Bayle.
Welcome to Lecture 12, Skepticism and Calvinism, the case of Pierre Bayle. If ever there were a major disjuncture between the reputation of someone in his own lifetime and the century that followed him, and the obscurity into which he has fallen today, I think Pierre Bayle would occupy the highest position in that category. To paraphrase Andy Warhol, I suppose everyone has merely his 150 years of fame. But Pierre Bayle was, in so many ways, one of the most influential, certainly one of the very few most widely read authors of the 17th century, whose appeal lasted throughout the first half of the 18th century, when he is someone whose works are in everyone's private library, in everyone's home, required reading for anyone who wishes to appear an educated person conversant with the debates of other educated people, and he is virtually unknown today. And yet, given his importance in the 17th century and our function here as intellectual historians trying to understand the life of that culture of the 17th and 18th centuries, Pierre Bayle is remarkable and illustrative of 17th century tensions and dilemmas. Bayle is also someone whose reputation, first in his own culture and then among scholars who always retained an interest in him, has undergone a truly astonishing metamorphosis. Bayle is known throughout almost all of his own lifetime as a deeply pious, erudite French Calvinist, and the term for that is Huguenot. French Calvinist, Huguenot thinker. He is accused by Calvinists with whom he is in debate of irreligion. Those charges are not taken very seriously at all during his lifetime. He is then adopted by the French Enlightenment, in one of the great ironies of early modern intellectual history, as one of their own and one of their forebears. And throughout the 18th and 19th and well into the 20th century, Pierre Bayle, this deeply religious, pious, fideistic thinker, if you will think back to the lecture on Pascal, is known as Bayle the unbeliever, Bayle the religious skeptic, Bayle, father of the Enlightenment. The revision in the understanding of Pierre Bayle occurs from the mid-20th century on, when scholars who simply cannot avoid his place in his own culture and the excitement that he generates and his influence throughout the 18th century begin to look beneath the 18th century's version of Bayle at the context, times, work, life of the man himself, producing a series of quite remarkable scholarly works that bring to life Bayle's Calvinism, his Calvinist background, his life in the French Protestant community in exile in Rotterdam after, in the late 17th century, French Protestants are expelled from France and toleration of them revoked. And from the mid-20th century on, there has emerged, on the basis of first-rate work and evidence and recreation of Bayle's context, a fuller understanding of Bayle as a fideistic and as a religious thinker who nonetheless had often extraordinarily subversive effects within his own culture and certainly within the religious life of his own culture. Bayle's influence in the early modern world scarcely could be overestimated. One of the reasons that scholars began to look at Bayle more closely in the mid-20th century is there was a vogue for a while of quantitative intellectual history. So intellectual historians needed something to count. And one of the things they decided to count were books that were owned in people's libraries in the 18th century. When you died in France, your estate passed through the courts, which did an inventory of your wealth, including your library, and listed every book you owned. And mid-20th century scholars were quite astonished to learn that Pierre Bayle's historical and critical dictionary was, in France and close to it in several other countries, the single most widely owned book published from the 16th century on in private libraries throughout the early to late 18th century. More people owned Pierre Bayle than owned the works of any other early modern author. What has made Bayle such a problematic figure is something that lies at the heart of the whole project of fideism itself. He has the pious goal of humbling reason to attempt to show our absolute dependence upon faith. And in order to accomplish that goal, what Bayle seeks to demonstrate, just as the tidal wave of confidence in reason is crashing over European culture, what Bayle sets out to demonstrate is the incompatibility of reason and faith. For Bayle, to demonstrate the incompatibility of reason and faith was to show the necessity of humble faith, the folly of a rational or empirical theology, the mystery of religion. And the mystery of religion is not a novel theme in the West. But Bayle is stressing the mystery of religion, best demonstrated, he believes, by showing the incompatibility of reason and faith at just that moment, when reason is becoming the touchstone of belief in Europe. And there lies the drama of Pierre Bayle. Knowing something about Pierre Bayle's career allows us to place his intellectual work in context. He is born into a French Calvinist, again, that is to say, Huguenot family in a France that bitterly persecutes its Protestant minority. He converts over religious issues upon which he reflects long from Protestantism to Catholicism, an act of sincerity that temporarily costs him the love and closeness of a family whom he cherished. After a few years as a Catholic, still obsessing on religious issues, he reconverts to a member of the Protestant Reformed faith, now entering that most dangerous of all conditions in Catholic France, that of a heretic, someone who has known the true Catholic faith and then abandoned it. He spends long years as a Calvinist teacher at the leading Calvinist institutes, academies, and seminaries of Europe. After the revocation of tolerance toward Protestants in France, when Bayle's own brother dies in the dungeons of Louis XIV, Bayle is at the center of the Huguenot community in exile in Rotterdam, in Holland, where he teaches the Calvinist young at a seminary and where he plays a major role as a leading Calvinist polemicist. And it is by placing Bayle in the context of the divisions of European Calvinism and apologetics and of Catholic Calvinist debate that one best can understand his works in the sense in which he meant them, and as well understand the dangers that they posed for a culture that is increasingly confident about the relationship of reason and religion. Bayle's publishing career also reveals his absolutely vital and central position in the world of 17th century erudition and debate. Every work that he publishes is the occasion of major debates. Most often he offends Catholic readers who see him as a Calvinist apologist. Within debates among Calvinists, he offends whatever camp he is not in by the force of his writing and by Bayle's, and it is an understatement to put it this way, tenacity in following an argument out to its last logical conclusion, and he is convinced that one must shock an audience and startle them out of their complacency by showing them the real nature of faith and belief. And then there is the truly unparalleled early modern publishing success of his historical and critical dictionary, a 4-volume alphabetically arranged series of articles about almost everything, in which innocuous articles that are quite brief contain explosive footnotes with major philosophical, religious, historical, scholarly, erudite commentaries. It will go through edition after edition, expanding, and it is that work that is one of the most widely owned and read works of the early modern world. Bayle is on a dramatic intellectual itinerary in which he believes, as Pascal, the fideist, also believed, that one must think well, that critical reason alone adequately humbles reason and makes one prepared for faith. In addition, Bayle is someone who has an ethic of erudition and truth. He believes that most European scholars, up through his own time, have written what they wished were true, rather than asked, what do we know is true about our own European history, about our own religion, about our own most revered figures. And Bayle is determined that faith never fear erudition and truth or critical reason. So let's pause for a moment and look at an article Bayle wrote in the dictionary that absolutely scandalized Europe. It is an article on King David in the Historical and Critical Dictionary. What does Bayle write about King David, above all in the footnotes? He tells us that King David was favored by God. Scripture says that. He was beloved by God. We know that David was saved and was beloved by God. And then, with Scripture as his source, he takes us through the life of David. He's a thief. He's a liar. He's an adulterer. Not only is he an adulterer, but he sends to die in battle the husband of the woman after whom he most lusts. In old age, He has himself covered with naked young women to stay warm. He plunders his own people and betrays them. And yet, David is beloved by God and king of Israel. When the 18th century, 30, 40 years after Bayle wrote the article on David, read it, they could read it in only one way. Look at the kind of person whom Scripture celebrates. And Bayle's article was taken as a subversive article whose goal was to lessen our respect for, if not destroy, our respect for Scripture and for the ethics of the Judeo-Christian tradition. But now let's see what intellectual history can do. Let's put Pierre Bayle in context. In the context of political debates and in the context of religious debates in which he participates. There is one vital political debate among the Huguenot community in exile in Rotterdam. The leader of that community, a man named Pierre Jurieu, is arguing for a Protestant European crusade against King Louis XIV, who has expelled, in the midst of bitter persecutions, the Protestants from France. Jurieu works to build an alliance among the major Protestant nations, including Holland, England, against King Louis of France. Bayle believes that Christianity is always pacifistic. It never urges violence, and that Scripture instructs us to obey the kings whom God has put above us. He also believes, we know, that the Protestants only will return to France when it is believed in France that they pose no danger to the state. Now, let's look at the actual debates between Jurieu and Bayle, between the two camps. The one says, it's true that Scripture says that kings are chosen by God and that we must obey them. But Louis XIV is a liar. He's a murderer. He's a thief. He's an adulterer. Now, the article on King David. King David is a liar, a thief, a murderer, an adulterer. In context, as everyone read it in Bayle's lifetime, the article on King David directly addresses the most central political issue of the Huguenot community. But now, let us look at the religious issues involved that Pierre Bayle took even more seriously. In the debates between Calvinists and Catholics, Catholics address with great force and success the Calvinist belief in predestination, that God elects in absolute mystery those whom He will save. The Catholic critics of Calvinism, with telling force, will say, so the worst sinner could be saved and the most pious person could be damned, given the Calvinist notion of predestination, given the Calvinist notion of the mystery of salvation, that it is something beyond human comprehension. And here, the full force of Bayle's article on King David is revealed. There are two choices. One abandons traditional Augustinian and Calvinist theology on the mystery of God's grace and power that surpasses all human understanding, or one defends it against the Catholics and defends the ineffable, incomprehensible will and mystery of God and grace. And there, the article on David explodes. Look at Scripture, Bale says. King David, by natural standards, committed every crime a human being could commit. Perhaps like the thief on the cross whom Christ saved in an act of mystery. But we are told by God Himself that David was saved, that David was beloved of God. And Bale asks, those Calvinists who want to deny the sins of David, are they willing to say that if a Calvinist, if someone saved by God commits crimes, they are not crimes? That would be the scandal. That would be the outrage. What must we do as human beings? We must judge as best we can naturally. David committed crimes. By any natural judgment, they are crimes. And what must we conclude from Scripture? That God's mysteries and God's will and God's grace are beyond natural human comprehension. That is irreligious, Bale asks, to say that the will of God is incomprehensible to man, that God's reasons surpass human understanding, that human beings are not the ultimate measure of things in the world. For Bale, one must humbly accept faith and the humbling of reason that comes with it, whatever that scandal. Because if there is to be faith, not persuasion, the mystery of faith, then there must be an obligation to natural judgment, an ability to distinguish between natural judgment on the one hand and the mystery of faith on the other. Other articles that Bale writes in the dictionary equally scandalize his contemporaries. 3 articles, for example, address the problem of evil. How could there be evil in the world given the infinite goodness of God? In one article, Bale addresses whether or not reason can overcome the problem of the coexistence of an infinitely good God and evil. And he revives Epicurus' argument from ancient Greece. He says there is no way to avoid the natural conclusion either God could prevent evil, but chooses not to, in which case, by any natural judgment, he is not good. Or God wishes to overcome evil, to prevent evil, but cannot, in which case he is not omnipotent. For Bale, there is no answer to that by natural reason. Belief in the goodness of God is a matter of faith that surpasses natural understanding. He looks at the question of evil from the perspective of the data of the world. And he scandalizes his contemporaries by putting into debate a Christian and a Manichaean. Manichaeanism was deemed one of the most absurd and hateful heresies in the history of religious belief. It argued that there were equal forces of good and evil, co-equal forces of good and evil who struggled for the world. And Bale argues if you put a Manichaean and the most rational, knowledgeable Christian in debate, the Manichaean could not be defeated because the evidence of unbearable human suffering and unhappiness and misery is so powerful that the only way we can reconcile it with the goodness of God is by means of faith, not by means of evidence. But that's exactly what faith is, something that surpasses human understanding. Bayle looks at theological justifications of the problem of evil. Well, if we hadn't sinned, we wouldn't have free will, and free will was a gift. It was good that God let us be noble and free to sin, even though Adam's fall has resulted in the catastrophe of humanity. Bayle shocks his contemporaries by likening it to the mother who knows with certainty that her daughter will be debauched at a dance and lose her virginity and her soul, but lets the daughter go so that the daughter could be a person of free choice. Would anyone excuse that mother on natural terms, Bayle writes? And yet, that is the situation of God. It is beyond human comprehension. It requires faith. But Bayle did not only address these arguments about the incapacity of reason to issues of religion, turning to physics for those who would see him later as an apostle of the new philosophy. Bayle revives Zeno's paradoxes of motion that prove the impossibility of motion. One of them is quite lovely. How could you have infinite time to travel and be unable to traverse a finite distance? Every step you take toward a wall cuts the distance by half. You travel infinitely, there's always the other half remaining of the distance. Infinite time, you don't traverse a finite distance. For Bayle, all areas of human belief show to us the incapacity of reason. And one doesn't determine there isn't matter in motion, and least of all, one doesn't determine that there is not a good God whose mysteries surpass our understanding. You determine the incapacity of human reason and the need for the gift of faith. Bayle is someone outraged by the religious intolerance of his age. That people have the confidence of their beliefs such that they will torture, imprison, and kill in God's name for them, indicates an arrogance of belief, a deadly arrogance of belief that is the absolute antithesis of Christian humility. The humbling of reason not only values faith for Bayle, it values humility, it values a tolerance in which you have no arrogance in your own belief and ask only to be left alone to follow your own faith and conscience without harm to others. Opposed by outraged theologians as someone writing dangerous works, Bayle attempts to criticize the very foundations of his culture's intellectual inheritance, trying to show, and here the fideist, the philosophical skeptic, and the Calvinist, and the defender of toleration and conscience join hands, trying to show that most Christians are superstitious and arrogant individuals who have departed from simple faith. And so he writes to show the history of the Christian fear of comets, the absurdity of witchcraft belief, the nonsense that most people have believed in most times and places. The reality, as he argues, that a society of Christians, given the mystery of salvation, could be less virtuous than a society of atheists, and indeed that if God chose, He could save those atheists by the mystery of His grace. For Baal, there has been an overextension of human claims and the arrogance of intellectual theology and avoiding simple, tolerant faith. We have provided a Christianity that abandons its mysteries, abandons the gift of faith, and in addition, slaughters, tortures, and imprisons each other as if the human mind knew enough to say, I know what God intended, and I know so much that I can kill and imprison on behalf of that. You ignorant villains, Baal is saying to his contemporaries. You think you know enough to kill and torture and imprison based on your interpretation of God, then I will run circles around you. I will reduce you to intellectual impotence. I will embarrass you. I will humiliate your pride and your reason. I will lead you to conclusions you never expected. It is a dramatic project, Baals, but note well that it is occurring as a tidal change is taking place in European culture. Given the growing commitment to rational and to evidentiary belief, Baal is increasingly read as irreligious for arguing that neither evidence nor reason but faith alone supports Christianity. Baal's David gives rise to Voltaire's article on David, almost word for word, taken from Baal's dictionary, but 2 generations later, how mocking of Scripture that article on David will seem. Fideism persists in Europe, but it is occurring on this transformative wave of naturalization and rational commitment. Pierre Baal is writing that faith has primacy over reason, just as the religious culture is abandoning the belief that the world is clearer if reason's light is diminished. It is a dramatic chapter in European intellectual and religious history. Thank you very much.
I'm Tom Rollins, president of the Teaching Company. Thank you for listening to these lectures from the Superstar Teachers series. We hope you enjoyed them as much as we did. To receive a copy of our latest catalog or to order more courses, please give us a call at 1-800-TEACH-12. That's 1-800-TEACH-12.